Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Joining us right now not to talk about snowstorms or 60-mile-per-hour winds, though he may want to. It's the editor of Quorum Report, Scott Braddock. Scott, good morning. How are you today?
Doing great, Chad. And, you know, one other thing about Klobuchar, she's a tough lady, apparently. The reports are she's also pretty tough on her staff, which may come up in the Democratic race for the presidency, that there was maybe a hostile work environment in her office. So I would give her credit for being out in the snowstorm, and we'll see if they ask questions about that. Somebody else said, that's a trait that is barely even worth mentioning for men because men run tight ships.
Yeah. Well, we've gone from binders full of women a few years ago to a binder hurled at, 80 miles per hour, possibly.
Yes, absolutely. They're standing there, by the way, right next to the river, which, if you're on the water, it makes it even colder.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Hey, let's take a look. We've got dueling, press conferences, or not really rallies down in El Paso today. Mm-hmm. This, to me, that's going to be fascinating to watch and see tomorrow what the narratives are out of these two dueling rallies.
Mm-hmm. The president is on his way to El Paso, and he's got a cavalcade of stars, if you will. Texas Republican royalty. You've got Governor Greg Abbott. You've got John Cornyn, which, by the way, Cornyn's office just announced in the last half hour or so that he would be joining the president at the rally. You've got Ted Cruz, who's going to be there. I'm interested to see why Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick apparently is, as far as I can tell, not going to be there. I asked his office this morning if he was going to join as well, because Patrick, of course, has been the president's man in Texas. It was his campaign chairman, and, of course, joined him on the last trip to the border. I guess he can't go to every single trip. There is some business to do at the state capitol, with the legislative session underway. But, as you know, the lieutenant governor had no problem missing the first day of the legislative session to be alongside the president in Washington. You've got the other rally, of course, is going to be Beto O'Rourke and his allies, and a lot of that has to do with, and this is where I think the national narrative may go, Chad, is that the rally that O'Rourke will hold will tell you a little bit more about whether O'Rourke is running for president.
Yes.
The kind of things that he says when he's responding to the president, the kind of rally that they hold. There's a rally that just looks like a protest against the other rally, and then there's a rally that looks like somebody who's running for president. So we'll see what that looks like. Yeah,
absolutely. And and I do think they're gonna compare crowd size, the national media.
Yep.
They're gonna look and I mean this is Democrat friendly territory.
It is, and we can expect that no matter what the crowd looks like, the president will say it's the largest rally on the border ever.
Yes.
Full stop. Period.
That's true.
On the other side, you may see that there's some crowd inflation. One of the toughest things you can do as a journalist, and this is why I had no sympathy for the national media when they were trying to, sort of go back and forth with the White House about how big the inaugural crowd was, a couple of years ago for the president. One of the most controversial things that you can cover as a journalist is just how big a crowd was, because the people who organize whichever rally it is will tell you, no, it was way bigger than whatever number you said, and the people on the other side will say, no, there's no way that there were that many people there. What I usually do, this is just a reporting tip, if anybody ever has to do this, I usually walk up and try to find a police officer who's on the scene, because they are trained to estimate crowd size for safety, for crowd control. And I'll just say, in an off-the-record sort of way, I'll say, hey, how many people you think that is? And they'll kind of tell me. Then I can say, law enforcement on the scene said it was this many people.
Yeah, that's the safe way.
I'm all about taking the pressure off of me, Chad.
That's a safe way of going about it. Visit with Scott Braddock of Quorum Report. So, obviously, you brought up Dan Patrick and the Lieutenant Governor not going to be there tonight. There is some interesting movement, I guess you could say, in the Texas Senate this week.
Very interesting. It looks like and we had reported last week at quorumreport.com that there may be a move to go ahead and get this property tax bill moving through the process. There is a meeting scheduled this afternoon for the Property Tax Committee that met in a marathon hearing last week after I talked to you. I think they were in the hearing room for about 14 hours listening to people on both sides of the issue, and they've got a meeting this afternoon that looks like the kind of meeting you have to go ahead and vote on the bill and get it moving. Now, of course, as we've talked about here on the show, voting it out of committee doesn't necessarily mean that it can be on the Senate floor immediately. One thing to watch closely is whether the Democrat who's on the Property Tax Committee votes for this thing, or at least votes to advance it through the process. That's one of the arguments you often hear in the Senate. By the way, you hear that argument in the Texas Senate, you hear that argument in the United States Senate. Sometimes someone will say they don't necessarily agree with the proposal as it's laid out currently, but they're okay with going ahead and moving the debate forward. There's only one Democrat on the Property Tax Committee, and if that Democrat, Chuy Hinojosa from South Texas, votes in favor of moving it forward, that will tell us whether or not this may be able to move through the rest of the process in the Texas Senate, because as we have discussed at some length here, there are only 19 Republicans in the Senate. It takes 19 votes to bring a bill to the floor once it's been kicked out of whichever committee it's in, and we do know that at least one of the Republican senators, Kel Seliger from Y'all's Way in West Texas, is at least skeptical of this proposal.
Well, and if it does have movement today, and depending on what the sole Democrat in the rally votes, what he may say, does that kind of give us a heads up as to how he will vote eventually to get it down onto the floor?
Yeah, I think so. For example, Hinojosa had said originally when this bill was filed that he felt like it was a good starting point and it was time to, in his words, roll up our sleeves and get to work on property tax legislation, something that offers relief but also is fair to the local governments, which, of course, during that hearing last week, you heard from a lot of local governments, county commissioners and city council folks, that they didn't think this was a good idea to cap their revenue at 2.5%. It may be that this can move through the process at a different rate. Maybe it moves at 3% or 4%, or as Senator Paul Bettencourt, the chairman of the committee, told me last legislative session, if you start using decimal points, there's lots of numbers between 2.5 and 6. So they've got room to negotiate here. And then something else that we've heard at quorumreport.com is that, and this was some chatter around the building last week, some folks who were close to various Republican senators were saying that one of the things that might be tried here is capping the local school districts at 2.5% and then breaking them up from the cities and counties and offering the cities and counties a deal at maybe 4% or 5%. We'll see how that would go over, but it would be sort of a divide and conquer strategy.
Yeah, it seems like that would be a little, how do I put it? Not confusing, but it would definitely add a little bit of confusion to the bill, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
When one of the selling points was this is going to be easy to read, your tax bill is going to be easy to read.
Right.
Everything was going to be easy, maybe not so much if they go that route.
Well, and it's a really good point because the Speaker of the House, Dennis Bonnen, before he was Speaker, when he was Ways and Means Chairman in the last legislative session, the thing that he put a premium on at the time was that sort of clarity, transparency. The part of the bill that he supported the most in the last legislative session had to do with making sure that when you get your tax bill, you can tell exactly who's taxing you what, right? Because it can be a little confusing right now, especially depending on which jurisdiction you're in. Everybody knows that the largest chunk of your tax bill, your property tax bill, is the local independent school district, and that's why there is the argument this session that's really gaining traction. But we still haven't seen a school finance bill, but the argument being that if you really want to get people's property taxes down, then what you need to do is rebuild school finance from the bottom up. But until we actually see the proposal on that, we won't know what they're talking about. So, to make the property tax bill even more confusing at this juncture, I think would sort of undermine what the Republican leadership is trying to do.
To make the property tax bill even more confusing on top of that, has there been any discussion that you have heard in the Capitol about how many counties are going to be exempted, and maybe it's too many counties that are going to be exempted, and kind of the battle that you see lining up even between counties and people who want property tax relief? Forget about the folks down in Austin, but just the people who live in some of these smaller counties.
Well, and Matt Martin mentioned this on the morning show on KFYO last Friday, that y'all had gotten some calls at the station from folks who said that it didn't seem fair to them that you've got the lieutenant governor, and the governor especially, and the speaker maybe to a lesser extent, selling this property tax quote unquote reform as a huge way to offer relief to people and put a downward push on tax rates all across the state. And then some folks in smaller counties, as Matt said, there's some places where they could, maybe buy one additional police car, and that would put them over the 2.5 just because they have a very, very small budget. Those folks, some of them have said, well, they would like to be able to vote on that too. Why is it only that people in the big cities, in the big urban areas like Houston and Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, et cetera, why is it they're getting this property tax relief and we're not? And if you look at the reason that the small counties are exempted and the small cities and small taxing entities that are collecting under $15 million, in sales taxes and property taxes, the reason they're exempt, Chad, is because it's supposed to make rural lawmakers a little more comfortable supporting these things, because then their local governments wouldn't be giving them grief for having voted for it. But what might happen is the opposite effect, where some voters in some of those areas might say, hey, why are we left out of this thing?
Right.
So we'll see how that shakes out, too. It's yet to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. What do we have as far as the week ahead in the ledge goes?
Well, the House and Senate will be back in this afternoon, and they're really getting down to work on the budget, and this is where it gets, if you want everybody's eyes to glaze over in the audience, we can get down into every single thing that they're talking about in all the articles of the budget. But this is the heavy lifting right now. I mean, you've got the House and the Senate are both in the Finance Committee in the Senate and the Appropriations Committee over in the House. They're getting down into each of the articles of the budget and looking at all of the different aspects of how they're going to spend your money. So all very important. We keep up with it, at quorumreport.com. But they're, getting into that work, and they're starting to delve into some of what the governor designated as his emergency items. By the way, I would note that one of the emergency items was not border security this time around, although it does sound like they're still willing to spend about $800 million, at least on the Senate side for sure, in state funds to continue to secure the border as President Trump comes to rally for border security.
Speaking of border security, there was a report out of Breitbart that two state reps are looking at possibly introducing legislation that would fund, $2.5 billion for wall construction. I guess it would take it out of the rainy day fund. Is that correct?
Yeah, State Representatives Kyle Biederman and Briscoe Cain, two of the Freedom Caucus-style members, have said that they think $2.5 billion is a fair number to start building some physical barrier along the international boundary with Mexico. And, make no mistake, we have the money, $2.5 billion, it's there. We have actually about $15 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund, although I'm not sure that filling in the gaps for what they're not willing to do in Washington is what anybody ever intended for them to use the that fund for, especially when there are other huge needs, including property tax relief, school finance, and the fact that they still have to figure out how much money they're going to spend to backfill those local communities that were damaged so badly by Hurricane Harvey. There's only so much money to go around, Chad. Yeah. And look, this is the federal government's responsibility. I think that's what you're going to hear from most Republicans in response to a proposal like this. But in the past, it has been, Dan Patrick said it this way a few weeks ago. He said, look, it seemed sort of nuts to people that we would spend $800 million in state revenue, in your tax dollars at the state level, for border security. But then he said, in the same breath, that it's sort of, over the last 4 or 5 years, has been thought of as just a natural now, that's how much we'll spend. But I would say it'd be a much heavier lift to convince people that $2.5 billion is what we ought to be spending from state dollars when they're not even willing to do that at the national level.
Well, and real quick, refresh my memory, because the last time the president visited the border, you had this report that the lieutenant governor had floated the idea of Texas building a portion of the wall.
Right.
But I don't think anything really ever came out of that. And, again, refresh my memory, I don't believe the governor even embraced that idea, did he?
If I remember right, it was that the idea was not that we would pay for it, but that the federal government would give us money, and then we would start working on it.
Okay.
And that President Trump at the time, I'm trying to remember exactly what he said, but President Trump at the time said, It didn't say it was the best idea ever, but it wasn't the worst idea ever, something like that. Like that. So yeah, they continue to go back and forth about exactly what ought to happen here.
Yeah, all right. Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. Tell folks what they can find at the Quorum Report today and all week long.
All week long, we'll be focused on the budget. We'll be focused on this argument about border security as well and your property taxes. You can sign up for our free emails at quorumreport.com, quorumreport.com. We'd love to have you.
All right. Follow him on Twitter at Scott Braddock. Scott, as always, appreciate your time. We'll visit with you next week.
It's my pleasure, Chad. Talk soon.
Have a good one. That's Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report.